Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. March 2, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. More on Spicoli death. Vince McMahon on Off the Record. By Observer staff. So will the death of Louis Spicoli become a wake-up call for the industry, or at least for the people in the industry that it needs to be a wake-up call for? The death of a 27-year-old is a tragedy. In the aftermath there have been more discussions about who will be next rather than what can be done to stop someone from being next. The reason is that this isn't a simple issue. There are no easy answers. But will this precipitate major or even minor changes in the industry or in the behavior of those in the industry? If history is any indicator, not a chance. Indeed, the situation that has been discussed more in the past week seems to be how lucky the industry is that this doesn't happen with more frequency. Spicoli, real name Louis Mucciolo of San Pedro, California, was eulogized at a funeral on February 20th in front of about 175 friends and local area wrestlers. Sabu and Rob Van Dam from ECW were two of the pallbearers given the night off by the company and were the only representatives of major organizations attending. Most of the wrestlers and the Southern California independent scene attended, some of whom had known him since he showed up at wrestling school at the age of 16 wanting to know whether Honky Tonk Man really hated Jake the Snake. Tommy Dreamer, Beulah and Little Guido, who often roomed with Spicoli on the road in ECW, attended a wake the previous evening and former ECW wrestler Mustafa also attended. With virtually all the major names in WCW having worked the previous night in Birmingham, it would have been next to impossible for them to attend. ECW held a 10-bell salute before its show the next night in Philadelphia with all the wrestlers together, with the exception of Just Incredible having to do with a rather tasteless angle involving the death of Tommy Dreamer's grandfather, which will air on its television show this coming weekend and dedicated the house show that night to his memory. During the show, Dreamer used a Death Valley driver in his match and paused and looked above, and during the main event, Sabu had Spicoli's name written in tape on his arms and Van Dam wore a Spicoli t-shirt in their match against Bam Bam Bigelow and Shane Douglas. WCW was heavily criticized during the week for its handling of the death on Nitro the day after, in particular the comments of Larry Zbyszko on Nitro basically blowing it off and staying in wrestling storyline character, who was the only person allowed to speak during the show on the subject, and by several who attended the funeral due to its lack of presence at the event. WWF never mentioned it on any of their television shows, but did acknowledge the subject on its hotline and internet site. In the case of Spicoli, he was viewed as a wrestler and a person heavily influenced by his peer group. In both ECW and WWF, when getting small breaks, he began trying to fit into the Elite Stars clique, and behaved like they did, or he perceived they were, to fit in. The problem is he wasn't an elite star and in both organizations it caused his star to dim. This is an industry where, maybe not due to but certainly relating to the heavy travel schedule, the lifestyle, the type of people who associate with it and gravitate toward it, where there are going to be problems. It's a reflection of society at large, but it's also an excuse to say it's no different from society at large because the problem per capita is far more significant. Don't think this subject wasn't broached in all three major U.S. organizations over the past week, but as mentioned, the answers aren't easy. It's ridiculous to even consider banning prescription drugs such as painkillers, sleep aids, or muscle relaxers. There is too much of a physical pounding that wrestlers take, and those who take pills, the majority probably aren't abusing the drugs or taking them in anything close to dangerous amounts. At the same time, if Spicoli died from a bad combination, combining somas, a sleep aid/muscle relaxer, with alcohol, a similar combination that was believed to have been the cause of death of Art Love Machine Bar in 1984. It's a combination that is prevalent within the industry on a nightly basis. Spicoli's problems were known in management in both WWF and ECW, and probably played a significant part in his departure from both groups. What WCW management did or didn't know about Spicoli in particular isn't clear other than at about the time he was first hired by the company last summer, the subject was broached with him and he denied having any kind of a problem. Eric Bischoff said that he was unaware Spicoli, who got his job through a recommendation from Scott Hall, had any problems of the sort until finding out over the past week. Over the past week, many talked about other sides of Spicoli's personality. The basic feeling from those who knew him from the start seemed to be he was just a guy who started very young in wrestling and when he started, idolized the top stars and emulated them. His problems seemed to start as the proverbial freshman in high school syndrome trying to fit in with the seniors. You never really know, but the feeling seemed to be that if he wasn't in pro wrestling, he'd have been influenced by a different peer group and the end result would have been different as well. The subject of drug testing has come up in a lot of circles. Bischoff said that WCW randomly drug tests its wrestlers and also gives all wrestlers mandatory tests at the same they sign their contracts. He said that all the top stars are tested, and many of them have failed at times, but the company doesn't publicize its failures due to a confidentiality clause in the testing policy, and that all those who fail have to take an educational class on the subject. He denied that there was anyone in the company with a contract that stipulates they can't be drug tested and claimed the testing procedure was more stringent than the WWF. In WWF, when testing was done on a regular basis, it became apparent some of the failures because they would have been suspended for 6 weeks or a second positive meant a trip to rehab. Many of those who failed tests didn't become known, as Vince McMahon often allowed those who tested positive for a first time to continue working and continuing their programs and television appearances but get paid only road expenses so as to keep continuity going and to not call attention to the failures. According to Bischoff, Spicoli was tested on 2 occasions, once last summer when he signed the contract and again in January, passing both times. Since Spicoli had a prescription for the somas he was using, that usage wouldn't have come up as a positive on a drug test. The question is, what is the goal of testing? To try and answer that, we have to take a trip back in history. The WWF was the first promotion to regularly drug test. It started in the late 1980s. At the time, the WWF was marketing its product to very young children. Its role model superstars would preach saying no to drugs, and many of them behaved just the opposite. Even with the 2 recent deaths, from most accounts the problems in the mid-80s, particularly with cocaine, were worse than today. It was a relatively frequent occurrence for wrestlers to be so loaded that they either missed shots, or performed obviously loaded in the ring, and that was hardly in those days limited to the WWF. Those situations are rare today. The catalyst for starting the testing was that cocaine usage was prevalent, and problems stemming from that were out of hand in some individuals, including major stars, combined with bad publicity the company got when Jim Duggan and Iron Sheik, who were feuding at the time, were caught together in a car with some pot. Both men were suspended, although it appeared at the time the embarrassment may have been more because Mr. USA and the hated Iranian heel were in the same car. But cocaine testing began shortly thereafter. In 1991, Dr. George Zaurian, a Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission appointed doctor, well known in the industry for supplying both steroids and painkillers to wrestlers largely at the WWF, including many of the top names like Hulk Hogan, Vince McMahon and Roddy Piper, was convicted in a landmark steroid case and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The WWF's first reaction to the conviction was to try and separate itself from Zaurian and misleading its own policy, claiming to have the most stringent drug policy in all of sports. At the time they were testing for only cocaine, and claiming the trial had nothing to do with the WWF. But due to media pressure, in large part from New York Post sports columnist Phil Mushnick, the company expanded its testing to steroids and later even to marijuana. There were a variety of reasons for this, but one of them had to be that the company felt it was imperative at that point in time that the timing would be real bad if one of its wrestlers were to be arrested on drug charges. Some wrestlers rebelled. Several quit. Many stayed, and by the end of 1992, the entire face of the company had changed from a company built on steroid monsters to one where smaller but more talented mid-card wrestlers, like Bret Hart, and later Shawn Michaels, became the face of the company. The testing didn't eliminate all problems, but it did cut down on them. In 1992, Kerry Von Erich was arrested for forging fake prescriptions and was given probation. Although Von Erich was brought into the company as a headliner, his stock had fallen and the problems no doubt were a part in his eventually being released. After being released, he was caught with cocaine in his rental car, which would have been a probation violation, and rather than go to jail, killed himself. In 1994, McMahon himself was put on trial charged with a conspiracy in the distribution of the steroids among his wrestlers during the Zaurian years and a second possession with intent to distribute charge, the first of which he was declared not guilty because the evidence against him wasn't strong enough, and the second was dropped due to both a lack of evidence and no evidence the crime had been committed in the venue under jurisdiction to the court in question. A few years later, while on a hiatus from the company but still under contract, Bryan Adams was arrested on steroid and weapons charges, and was immediately fired, although he was eventually brought back several years later, with his arrest actually as part of his storyline gimmick as the heel crush in the Nation of Domination. Would more frequent regular testing have changed the end result of Spicolli and or Brian Pillman? In the case of Spicolli, the answer is no. He was in the WWF at a time when there was a regular testing. What is believed to have killed him, the full autopsy report and cause of death isn't expected until mid-March. In some form were not any illegal drugs that would have shown up in more frequent tests. According to those close to him, what he was doing at the time of his death wasn't any different than what he was doing while in the WWF, during which point he had one close call, and he was being tested regularly at that point. Since the death, WWF officials have admitted being aware of the problem and even discussing the problem with him before he was ultimately let go. When the WWF testing got so comprehensive to also include marijuana, there was a feeling among wrestlers that it would lead to an increase in alcohol abuse. But in reality it turned the abuse of prescription painkillers, and not steroids or cocaine, into the biggest drug problem. But to blame testing for marijuana on this problem doesn't hold up, because from all accounts the problems, if anything, have gotten worse since testing was for the most part dropped. There were wrestlers referred to as Von Erichs waiting to happen, that would regularly pass their drug test because they were using high levels of legal medication prescribed by marked doctors who wanted to rub elbows with television stars. Some got help. Some didn't. Some wound up out of the company and others didn't. Pillman is a far more complicated issue. Would Brian Pillman be alive today if the WWF hadn't have toned down its drug testing procedures? Nobody truly knows the answer to that question because there is no definitive answer. Only guesses. The same kind of guesses in the Gould pools trying to make black humor over the subject over who will be the next to follow in line. Just when you thought everything that could be said had been said about the finish of the Bret Hart vs. Shawn Michaels match, the story is back, and assuredly, not for the last time, with McMahon admitting on national television in Canada that he did lie to Hart about the finish, claiming he needed to do so to make sure Hart didn't no-show the date. Vince McMahon taped 2 segments on the TSN Sports talk show Off the Record on February 21st with Michael Landsberg, the same show Bret Hart appeared on 3 times in recent months. The segments aired on February 23rd and February 24th. With the first segment dealing with Hart controversy. When asked why he wanted Hart out, McMahon said, "A lot of reasons, actually. Bret was breaking down physically. Bret was getting to be a little bit of a pain in the ass in terms of his attitude. He was disruptive in the locker room to a certain extent. He wanted things his way. To a certain extent I can understand that. But we have to move on and we have to progress in what we do. We can't hold back. We can't keep things the way that they used to be for anybody." Bret's body started to break down. He started to miss dates and things of that nature, and what's to be expected, I suppose, although you look at him as the Iron Man, and certainly he has been that in this industry. But Bret's value began to wane, and I looked at it in terms of I think I was really sorry after I'd done the deal. I was sorry that I had. Had everything gone smoothly, then we would have lived with it. That's not what happened. It didn't go smoothly. I wanted to change Bret's character. I wanted to be able to mix things up. That was difficult. He was difficult to do business with. It was sort of like the tail wagging the dog. It was then that I decided that, maybe Bret might be better off financially somewhere else. We thought we would be better off financially without Bret. The host brought up that Michaels is clearly breaking down physically, and McMahon said that since Hart was earning more, he felt he was entitled to more from him. He said before signing the 20-year contract in 1996 that Hart had leveraged himself because of the multi-million per year offer from WCW, and McMahon claimed people around him were insisting to him that he couldn't let Hart go, and he listened to them and is now sorry that he did from a financial standpoint. McMahon admitted that Hart had reasonable creative control over the last 30 days of the contract period, a period which began on November 1st and is well established, included the match in question. McMahon first claimed that he never agreed to the finish of Hart winning via disqualification, that he had asked Hart for a finish, losing the title, and Hart said no, and claimed that by saying no, as he did a few times, that Hart had already breached his contract several times. Landsberg pressed McMahon asking if Hart has been lying everywhere when he said he had an agreement with him for the DQ finish, and McMahon admitted that Hart wasn't lying, and got into the ring thinking that was going to be the finish. When Landsberg said, "Which to me says that you agreed to that finish with him, right?" McMahon claimed, "No, I didn't agree." Landsberg, "So where's the confusion here?" McMahon, "I don't know that there is any confusion. Bret thought that." Landsberg, "Why did he think that, Vince?" McMahon, "Bret thought that there was going to be a disqualification because he had heard it. Bret had every reason to think it was going to be a disqualification. I knew otherwise." Landsberg, "Where did he hear that from, though?" McMahon, "No, he heard it from everyone who set it up, including me." Landsberg, "So when he says that you lied to him as he was heading into the ring, he's right." McMahon, "I couldn't take a risk after asking, after he breached his contract several times before, denying what it was that we wanted. I couldn't take a risk that he was going to just walk out and leave fans all over the world with nothing." Landsberg, "What was your fear at that point from a business standpoint?" McMahon, from a business standpoint, I was afraid Bret wouldn't go through with the match. If Bret didn't get in the ring and have a match, I was afraid we would make our fans extremely angry. That was the most important thing. Second from that though is doing the right thing business-wise and doing what your employer asks you to do when in fact it's not going to damage you whatsoever in any capacity. McMahon claimed that the only person who believes that Bret Hart is a Canadian hero is Bret Hart, which Landsberg disagreed with. McMahon, he plays the part of a Canadian hero. Bret Hart is a human being. Although he may think he's a Canadian hero, I don't think so. Landsberg, Vince, believe me, Bret Hart is a Canadian hero. What McMahon stated is the portrayed image of Hart that is a hero and that the fans don't know the man Hart. Landsberg noted that's true of any athlete, and brought up Wayne Gretzky saying, his fans don't know him any better than they know Bret Hart. McMahon said there is a difference, pointing out that pro wrestling has things orchestrated and that if Hart is a Canadian hero, it is Vince McMahon and the WWF and all the other WWF wrestlers that made him a hero. The punch was brought up, with Landsberg noting that Hart, who was naked and getting out of the shower, warning McMahon to leave the dressing room, and if he was still there when he had his clothes on he was going to punch him. He asked why McMahon stayed. There is a great deal of speculation, belief in many quarters that McMahon actually, without Hart's knowledge, manipulated that situation as a way to portray himself to his upset crew of wrestlers as somehow being the victim, particularly since it was McMahon who just a few days earlier had suggested doing an angle where Hart would get screwed in the match and punch him hard enough to open him up on live television the next night. By suggesting that angle, McMahon was more than willing to take a punch to get over an angle, and this being just another angle he was manipulating. McMahon said that he instructed the people with him, including his son, to let Hart punch him but that hopefully Hart wouldn't. Landsberg came back with, and in the end that turned out to be a good move for you from a business standpoint, right? Because it gave you leverage on Bret Hart, legal leverage on Bret Hart, and good publicity to be the guy who gets hit rather than the guy who does the hitting. No. If anything, it didn't give me any good publicity. On the contrary. Bret knocking Vince McMahon down, I don't know that 9/10 of the locker room wouldn't be going, yeah, Bret, way to go, way to go. And so the loyal followers of Bret who have only Bret's point of view would think that was a cool thing for him to do, is knock me down. So, no, there was no publicity. In terms of leverage, I guess, Bret, I don't know too many people who would look at that as a business move. You're gonna walk over and let a professional wrestler's haul off and knock you down. So that wasn't really on my mind as a business move. I owed Bret an explanation if he wanted it, and you know what, and I felt I owed Bret one shot if he wanted to take that too. Sources close to Hart, and Hart himself, were mad at the negative portrayals of him, particularly the one about missing dates and being a negative influence in the locker room. With the exception of the period after his knee surgery, and for the record just days after surgery he, against medical orders, flew to Omaha to appear on a live Raw broadcast in a wheelchair, Hart claimed to have only missed one booked date between the start of the year and the Montreal match, a bout in Hershey, Pennsylvania in late October that McMahon had 1 week earlier agreed to give him off because it was 1 day and a half after returning from an overseas tour of Bahrain, and he asked for a few days off to train since the quality of the match with Michaels was felt to be so important. Although this is a moot point now since he left before any of this took place, but there were a few major house shows in November that he wasn't booked on. WWF sources said that he had asked for a lighter schedule at the end of the year due to injuries creeping up on him. Hart denied ever making that request. However, even with time off for the knee injury, Hart's $1.5 million per year contract with the WWF specified a maximum of 180 dates, and he had already topped 200 in 1997. Hart claimed even though his maximum dates had already been surpassed a few months early, he never asked for a lighter schedule for the remainder of the year. Michaels had complained publicly that Hart was refusing to do the PR work expected of a top star. A few interesting notes in postscript. McMahon's portrayal that all along he was going to find a way to have Hart lose the match differs from the view he presented to his top lieutenants at the time of not having made the decision to do the double cross until that afternoon itself, after a conversation with Hart in Montreal where he claimed Hart had refused to drop the title at any time, and that this would be his one and only chance to get it back. The claim from several at the top was that in the production meeting the night before, the scenario discussed was Hart winning by a DQ, a lame duck storyline planned to build for the subsequent pay-per-view in Springfield, Massachusetts, where Hart would lose the title in a Final Four match and Michaels would become the champion on December 7th, and then on live TV on December 8th bid farewell to the WWF, thanking the organization and the fans. It has also been confirmed that Eric Bischoff was contacted and had agreed to the entire scenario as proposed, and even though Hart's contract with WCW began on December 1st, was going to allow him to finish up with WWF on December 8th. There were and are questions, in particular Jim Ross on the 900 line before the card but after the production meeting talking about how McMahon had taken himself off the broadcast team and that it could very well be Hart's final match in the WWF. In addition, the November bookings done before Survivor Series for the major house shows had Michaels vs. Undertaker listed as the main event, although of course at that point in time not billed as title matches, with champion Hart in semi-final tag team matches teaming with Davey Boy Smith. While the champion isn't always the main eventer at the house shows, he usually is, and the way the booking for the main events were done and how the title picture turned out certainly worked out conveniently. There was also a sheet sent out 2 days before the match to the music people listing whose music is to be queued up and when, listing that it was Michaels' music, not Hart's, as to play at the end of the match. For credibility purposes with the wrestlers, since McMahon obviously knew, it was in McMahon's own best interest to portray it to the wrestlers as if as few people knew as possible to not ruin whatever is left of the credibility of his lieutenants with the crew. The idea that Hart wasn't willing to drop the title or that Hart was going to show up on Nitro, assertions both made to me and to the wrestlers in the company, have both been discredited as time has gone on. There is documented proof regarding the former, and Hart had a documentary being produced on his career that was traveling with him, and all were scheduled to be in Ottawa, not Memphis, the next day. And finally, about 90 minutes before the match started, Julie Hart, Bret's wife, who was at the show, was being interviewed. At the time, she already knew the agreement for the finish, but in the interview, said that she didn't believe it was going to end that way and wouldn't believe it until the match ended, saying she's seen fast counts before. There was a missing piece in the ultimate puzzle that was expected to be a small mainstream stir, but the end result was that Sting regained the vacant WCW heavyweight title, no doubt temporarily, beating Hulk Hogan in the main event at Super Brawl on February 22 at the San Francisco Cow Palace. The show drew a sellout crowd of 12,620 fans, 11,954 paying a new city record gate of $310,974 plus $127,312 in merchandise, to the outdated facility which is probably one of the world's most famous pro wrestling arenas. It was a typical WCW show. On the positive side, the booking in the top few matches was better than usual, which somewhat made up for the fact that the wrestling in those matches was non-existent. On the negative side, the undercard, while okay, was not at the level of some of the better WCW events. I saw it was a good, but not great job, which seems to have been the general consensus. The crowd heat was solid, but not spectacular, but it was a weird reacting crowd as it still seemed like San Francisco was what you'd call an ex-WWF city and that it wasn't so much a heel crowd as much as a crowd to see the ex-WWFers, most of whom are sorta heels. In the lone dark match, Ultimo Dragon, Yoshihiro Asai, pinned Shiryu Kazuhiro Hayashi, the former Michinoku pro wrestler who now works for Promo Azteca that both WWF and WCW had expressed interest in over the past few weeks. The only reports I heard were that it was disappointing. 1. Booker Huffman won the WCW TV title from Rick Martel, Richard Vigneault, in 10:23. Martel walked to the ring in a heel persona smirking. Martel blew out his knee early in the match, believed to have been a torn medial collateral ligament. The two ended up working a fairly good match which had a lot more heat than previous matches between the two. At one point Martel got the Boston Crab on and there was a huge pop when T made the ropes. They traded a lot of near falls until Martel came off the top rope with a crossbody block, but T caught him coming down with a Harlem side kick for the finisher. 2 3/4 stars. 2. Booker T pinned Perry Satullo in 14:23 to retain the TV title. Saturn jumped into the ring and put the rings of Saturn on immediately, but T made the ropes. Saturn got several near falls early. Both guys worked hard, but there were blown and mistimed spots as well. After a pescado, Saturn hit a Vader bomb on the floor but sold it like his bad left knee was blown out. He sold the knee big the rest of the match, although in reality he was fine after the match. T did an awesome drop kick off the top at one point. Saturn threw a lot of big suplexes out, but the match went long and they weren't getting much heat. Saturn used a quebrada in the ring, but then there was a miscommunication as both went for moves at the same time and you had that time standstill hesitation. Finally Saturn went for a power slam but his knee buckled. T came back with an axe kick but missed a Harlem hangover. Saturn came back with a Northern Lights suplex and a German suplex, but T finally got the fall after a side kick. 1 1/4 stars. 3. Disco Inferno Glenn Gilberti, Pinbla Parka, Adolfo Tapia, in 11:41. This was a weird match in that the work itself was good, but the crowd sees these two as Nitro undercard wrestlers and was bored with them in 3 minutes. After that point, there were boring chants as they were doing high spots. Parka threw a chair at him at the bell and later hit a corkscrew tope. Parka did a lot of dancing, and when the crowd didn't react to it, he did funny mannerisms making fun of the audience. Parka threw a lot of kicks with snap to them before getting a near fall with La Magistral. Parka held a lengthy chinlock trying to build heat for Disco, but that didn't work either. Parka did another tope, but later missed a shoulder block and hit the post. Disco came back with a reverse atomic drop, a well-timed clothesline and a swinging neck breaker for a near fall. Ref Scott Dickinson sold as if he'd been thumbed in the eye and Parka brought the chair into the ring. After a lot of struggling, Disco slammed Parka off the top rope, where he crashed into the chair, and hit the chartbuster for the finish. Naturally, the finish, being Steve Austin's move, got a huge pop. 2 1/4 stars. J.J. Dillon came out for an interview and said that no charges had ever been brought against Nick Patrick, and after reviewing the tapes they saw no evidence of wrongdoing and he was reinstated. Patrick still acted like a heel even though he kissed Gene Okerlund and hugged Dillon. Patrick then acted like he was going to ref the main event, but Dillon said he wasn't going to ref the main event. Then Patrick wanted to find out about his back pay. The original plan here was to get a famous lawyer from the most famous trial in recent history involved who would show up at the pay-per-view and legally bully Dillon into reinstating Patrick for the main event rather than Dillon having to basically reverse positions with no logical reason at all, other than the logic of Patrick never fast counting in the first place. Johnny Cochran was the first choice, but when that didn't materialize, they completed a deal for Robert Shapiro. I'm not making this up. Anyway, a few days before the show, Shapiro must have been talking with someone about doing it and the person told Shapiro how associating with pro wrestling would affect his image, so he backed out at the last minute, leaving WCW with no way to transition Angle A to Angle C after Shapiro nixed the deal. WCW made a last-ditch attempt to get Cochran, who claimed to have liked the idea and would have been willing to do it, but darn those previous commitments. 4. Bill Goldberg pinned Brad Armstrong, Robert James Jr., in 2:23 of an unannounced match. Goldberg added an overhead front suplex to his arsenal. Armstrong used his Russian leg sweep finisher, which Goldberg no-sold before going to the finish. It was what it needed to be. 1 star. 5. Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, retained the WCW Cruiserweight title, winning the Mask of Juventud Guerrera and Nibal Gonzalez in 13:29. Guerrera, who was really upset about losing his mask under these circumstances, wore Juvi forever on his tights. This was easily the best match on the show. Guerrera at one point did a springboard into a flying head scissors on the floor, which was too dangerous of a spot. The crowd got into Guerrera's hard chops. Jericho tried a German suplex, but Guerrera landed on his feet and went for a Hurricane Rana, but Jericho turned it into a hot shot. Jericho did a springboard dropkick and then on the floor, did a running leap off the steps, but Guerrera turned it into his own hot shot on the guardrail. Guerrera tried a springboard block, but Jericho turned it into a tombstone pile driver. Guerrera came off the top rope for a head scissors, but Jericho caught him and dropped backwards with him. Jericho was on the top rope, but Guerrera dropkicked him, sending him out of the ring onto the steps. Guerrera followed with his Air Juvie sideways bodyblock dive and in the ring followed with a tombstone and a 450 Firebird splash. Jericho got his hand on the ropes as the ref counted the fall and signaled for the bell. When the ref saw his hand on the ropes, he ordered a restart. The two went back and forth with great near falls and reversals, the highlight being when Guerrera reversed Jericho's lion tamer into a front cradle. At that point Guerrera went for a Hurricane Rana, but Jericho caught him in midair and turned it into a lion tamer for the submission. Guerrera unmasked, and there was a noticeable female pop when his mask came off, but unlike in Mexico, the unmasking wasn't really emphasized at all, nor did he mention his real name and reveal his identity. The reason Guerrera at first kept his hair in front of his face when he unmasked was because he wanted to hide the fact he was crying, particularly when he said how much he loved his father, since this really was a big deal to him and his family, even though WCW doesn't give a rat's ass about wrestling or family tradition anywhere else. 3 3/4 stars. 6. Davey Boy Smith beat Steve McMichael in 6:10. McMichael went into the match with a legitimate broken wrist or forearm. To explain the injury, they did this match where McMichael punched the ring post and Smith smashed the hand on the steps and guardrail before putting a wristlock on. The finish was exactly the same as the Guy Mesger Satoshi Hasegawa match on the December 20th Pancrase show, with Smith telling him to submit because the arm is going to break and McMichael refusing, and finally the ref stopping the match. After the match, McMichael was furious, claiming he never submitted and shoved Scott Dickinson down. That part, obviously, didn't occur in the Pancrase match. As usual, McMichael was awful. Dud. 7. Diamond Dallas Page, Paige Falkenberg, retained the U.S. title pinning Chris Benoit in 15:46. The first 5 minutes saw the two trade moves, with Benoit nearly getting the crossface, but before the hold was applied, Page made the ropes. Page went for the diamond cutter, but Benoit slipped out and left the ring. At that point the two started brawling and it turned into a good match. The crowd didn't seem to know how to react since neither of these guys were former WWFers. Toward the finish things picked up with Page doing a superplex off the top rope and a clothesline off the top for near falls. Benoit came back with the crossface, but Page made the ropes. Page hit a belly-to-belly for a near fall. Benoit came back with 3 rolling German suplexes for a near falls. When Page kicked out of the third German suplex, the crowd actually booed, hoping it would be a win. Page hit a DDT for a near fall and then got the pin after the diamond cutter. 3¼ stars. 8. Lex Luger, Larry Full, beat Randy Savage, Randy Poffo, in 7:26 of a no DQ match. Luger's ribs were all taped up, selling the injury from being attacked on Thursday. To sell the deal, Luger went for a press slam early, but the ribs gave out and he dropped Savage and began selling. Savage, who was knocked unconscious an hour before Thunder started and was still unconscious when it came time for the main event 3 hours later, wasn't selling any effects from the same said beating. Fans were totally for Savage and chanting Luger sucks. Perhaps the biggest pop of the entire show came when Luger racked Savage and Elizabeth did a run-in, raking Luger's eyes. At this point the NWOB team, Bagwell, Vincent, Scott Norton and Bryan Adams, did a run-in, but Luger and Savage teamed together to fight them off. The bell rang at this point, which made no sense since it was a no DQ match. Hogan then showed up and Luger racked Savage again. Hogan told the NWO group not to interfere and that he wanted to see Savage get beat, and Savage submitted and the bell rang a second time. There was never an explanation as to why the bell rang the first time. 3/4 star. 9. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall regained the WCW tag titles, beating the Steiners, Robert and Scott Reach Steiner, in 4:16. Fans were really into this match, with Hall and Nash getting the totally positive reaction. This wasn't a match at all, just a backdrop for the angle of Scott Steiner going heel. The angle itself was really good. Scott had come out looking mad and teasing the turn big time. After knocking the outsiders out of the ring, Rick was running around and kneeled on the ground like a dog with Scott on top of him. Scott then turned on him to a huge face-like reaction. He also decked Ted DiBiase, who was then posted by Dusty Rhodes. Hall went to pin Rick, who kicked out the first time, then fought his way out of the corner. Scott wouldn't tag him, and he ended up being overpowered. Hall went for the edge, but simply couldn't lift him the first time, but got him the second time for the pin. Scott then threw Ref Dickinson, who seemed to have been having a bad night by this point, out of the ring. Funny thing was, after cheering his turn, when Scott gave the NWO hand signal and climbed on the ropes, the crowd booed him heavily. Go figure. 1¼ stars. 10. Sting, Steve Borden, regained the vacant WCW title, beating Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, in 16:32. Since Hogan books his own programs, it was no doubt his own insistence to swerve people at the last minute. But since he was doing the job, he dominated virtually the entire match. The negative of that is his offense is beyond bad. Match was saved by having a very good storyline. With the match at its most pathetic, Tony Schiavone screamed how this was Hogan at his best. Hogan never left his feet until one 3-stage lame bump from a reverse atomic drop. Sting whipped him 4 times with a belt, but then fighting outside the ring, Sting missed the Stinger Splash on the floor and crashed into the guardrail. But back in the ring, Sting used a Stinger Splash and got the Scorpion on, but Hogan made the ropes. Sting went for another Stinger Splash, but ref Charles Robinson got caught in the middle and that was the end of him. Of course Patrick came running down, while Hogan leg dropped Sting. Patrick counted and Sting kicked out. Hogan got mad at Patrick for not counting fast. Hogan started throwing punches and Patrick stopped Hogan from throwing them. Most of the rest of the match saw Hogan go for pins, not get them, and argue with Patrick about them. Finally Sting made the Superman comeback with 2 Stinger Splashes and went for the reverse DDT. On the way down, Hogan kicked Patrick, who went down. At this point the NWO Stooge squad of Khan, Norton, Bagwell, and Vincent ran out, with Sting taking them all out. While this was going on, Savage hit the ring and KO'd Hogan with a spray can. Patrick revived and counted as Sting pinned Hogan. Hogan sold the blow for several minutes, allowing Sting to spray paint WCW on Hogan's back as the show went off the air. 1/2 star. Just days before its 4th pay-per-view show, The lineup for ECW's Living Dangerously show on March 1st from Asbury Park, New Jersey hasn't been officially finalized, but there is going to be one unique twist. For one of the first times in pay-per-view history, a match is going to be taped before the show to air during the show when Sandman faces Sabu in a dueling Canes match. The idea is that rather than risk putting a rematch of the match which took second in last year's voting for Worst Match of the Year on live pay-per-view, that they will have the match and then edit whatever needs to be edited out of it, and then air the match during the show. The storyline behind this is planned to be that they will claim that the pay-per-view censors, those prudish people who allow them on the air almost everywhere now, wouldn't allow the rematch to air, but that since they are on the air they are going to defy the censors and air the match anyway. Well, you can't say it isn't creative. It won't be the first time a match has been taped for pay-per-view, although it will be the first time the truth will ever be told on a pay-per-view about a match being taped if the plans don't change. WWF has had taped matches, in one case a match taped about 1 month earlier when doing double half matches, the Roddy Piper vs. Goldust Brawl in the Street that aired at WrestleMania in 1996 and the Undertaker vs. Mankind Boiler Room segment of their SummerSlam match later that year. WCW's most famous incident of taping a pay-per-view match ahead of time but pretending it was live came for the Dustin Rhodes vs. Blacktop Bully, Barry Darsow match in the back of a truck which was taped several days before the pay-per-view, and wound up with both wrestlers being fired from the company for violating company policy by blading during the match. Besides the matches already announced, Taz vs. Bam Bam Bigelow for the ECW TV title, Shane Douglas and Chris Candido vs. Lance Storm and a mystery partner, Tommy Dreamer vs. Justin Credible and Masato Tanaka vs. Wing Kanemura. The other matches added will be a three-way dance with Axl Rotten and Balls Mahoney, New Jack and Spike Dudley and Devon and Bubba Ray Dudley, and a probable singles match with Rob Van Dam. Paul Heyman was attempting to get Too Cold Scorpio through Titan Sports to put over Van Dam, but as of last word had not finalized the deal with Titan Sports. Most of the questions regarding ECW on pay-per-view have been answered as the previous two shows have established the buy rate level at about 0.2. This show appears to have less hype than the previous shows, but it is also the first show airing on Time Warner Cable in New York City, which is one of the promotion's strongest markets, so realistically if anything that 0.2 figure should be a minimum this show should do and probably will do slightly better than that. A real big test was the third show, because it followed up a week's second show but the buy rate basically held steady. In addition, All Wrestling is noticeably hotter than even a few months ago, which should also lead to an improvement in the buy rate. The promotion can maintain pay-per-view presence forever at that level with its total universe being approximately 23 to 25 million homes, with realistically only Cablevision, which is strong in New England, as the lone major conglomerate that hasn't agreed to carry the show. Some viewers' choice systems will also not be carrying the show because it's on a secondary Hot Choice channel as opposed to Viewers' Choice 1, which isn't available in a few million regular VC homes. It is believed the May 3rd pay-per-view will move to VC1, and negotiations are going on with Cablevision as well for the follow-up show, which would mean the show would be available just about everywhere WWF and WCW are. We're not certain of the Canadian market. The other internal question is whether ECW can, as it promised from its inception on pay-per-view, deliver a stronger product than WWF or WCW. It delivered, or at least came close to delivering on that promise on the first show, which was certainly among the best pay-per-view shows on 1997. Clearly that promise wasn't delivered on the follow-up two shows. There is also some question regarding the live gate in Asbury Park. As late as press time, with the top ticket price at $100, there were still second-row tickets left unsold. Going in one of the most loaded months for pay-per-view in history, and 2 weeks before the competition's biggest show in a few years, WCW has countered from a marquee value standpoint with its deepest show in recent memory. WCW Uncensored on March 15th in Mobile, Alabama, coming just 3 weeks after the Cow Palace pay-per-view, will be headlined by Hulk Hogan vs. Randy Savage in a cage match, Sting vs. Scott Hall for the WCW title, Lex Luger vs. Scott Steiner, The Giant vs. Kevin Nash, Bret Hart vs. Kurt Hennig, a triangle match for the U.S. title with Diamond Dallas Page, Chris Benoit and Raven, and a TV title match with Booker T likely against Eddie Guerrero. The original plan was Perry Saturn, but it may be changed, which also may be a title change as Guerrero is being groomed for the TV belt. A Hogan-Savage cage match with that kind of support underneath should by all rights do a huge buy rate. The fact wrestling is so hot right now only echoes that thought. But coming during a period where Super Brawl with a Hogan-Sting rematch was expected to do in the 1.5 buy rate range, and with WrestleMania expected to garner all sorts of mainstream publicity stemming from whatever angle is shot with Mike Tyson on March 2nd in Cleveland, this is a show sandwiched in the middle. But if anything, Hogan-Savage at this point is a hotter issue than Hogan-Sting based on recent television, and from a drawing standpoint, this show with the appearance of Hart, who didn't work the Cow Palace, and the rematch of Giant versus Nash coming off their angle, and with so much post-turn emphasis being put on Scott Steiner, the buy rate could wind up being at the same level. It is no coincidence that so many guns are being thrown out at one time to be competitive with the WrestleMania show. Going unopposed on February 16 with Raw preempted for the Westminster Dog Show was Nitro set its all-time record with a 5.10, 4.75 first hour, 5.20 seconds hour, 5.35 third hour, rating and 7.49 share. The record broke the mark set on August 25, also unopposed, which was a 4.97 rating. While a record average audience of 3,694,000 homes over 3 hours is certainly impressive, the number was actually a disappointment in many circles. WCW had just 2 weeks earlier hit the 4.93 barrier going head-to-head, and with a lot of hype and soap opera around a Hogan and Savage versus Luger and Sting main event, there were predictions of a rating approaching a 6.0, although the Olympics stood in the way of that level of a number. As it was, the rating actually peaked from 9:45 to 10 p.m. for a Hennig versus Bobby Eaton and beginning of Steiner's versus Bagwell and Norton match, which did a 5.6 quarter or 4,061,000 homes. That quarter came close to the all-time quarter-hour record for Monday nights since the head-to-head battle started, which was 4,153,000 homes for a Steve McMichael versus Eddie Guerrero match on August 25. The main event itself drew a 5.5 rating. As is usually the case, the Westminster Dog Show drew a larger audience than Raw, doing a 3.9 rating. Nitro Replay did a 1.1 rating and 5.5 share. Raw was moved to a Saturday night slot on February 21st and did a 3.0 rating and 5.0 share, numbers that have to be considered successful since over the past few years when Raw was preempted and moved to a new night, its audience didn't follow as well as WCW's and the ratings were in the 1.8 to 2.4 range. It bodes well, since on March 16th, Raw will be preempted again for the second half of the Moby Dick movie that USA is heavily hyping. That show, initially scheduled to be the final live show before WrestleMania, from Phoenix and to include Mike Tyson, will be moved to March 17th from 8 to 10 p.m. for February 23. Nitro drew a 4.59 rating, 4.93 first hour, 4.30 seconds hour, 4.55 third hour, and 6.86 share to Raw's 3.25 rating, 3.45 first hour, 3.05 seconds hour, and 4.81 share. Nitro Replay did a 1.0 rating and 4.5 share following the Sports Illustrated swimsuit special that was hyped to death for weeks but only did a 1.6 with a scary drop of 2.1 to 1.2 comparing the first and second hours, which showed something about the audience drawing power of that over 2 hours. The patterns were predictable. WCW grew the first hour and had its largest audience at 8:45 to 9 p.m. going unopposed with a 5.3, Dragon vs. Shiryu and Raven vs. Benoit. When Raw started, the rating fell to a 4.0 while Raw opened with a 3.4. Raw maintained and actually rose slightly to a 3.6, while Nitro grew, but also dropped for Con and Lismark, 4.2, Norton Bagwell vs. Voltage and Disco vs. Guerrero, 4.1, before only picking up slightly for Flair Armstrong, and that was with Raw having Blackman vs. Maivia with the Nation of Domination soap, which saw the rating decline from 3.6 to 3.2. The only story for the week was 10:30 to 10:45 when Nitro jumped from 4.3 to 4.7, Giant interview Hart/Flair vs. Hennig/Adams angle, while Raw dropped again from 3.2 to 2.8, Rock and Roll vs. Headbangers, Pete Rose interview. And another jump by Nitro to 5.1, continuation of Flair/Hart angle, and WO/Sting closing angle, while Raw dropped again to 2.6, Austin video, Mero vs. Owen and Sable/Luna angle, so by the close of the show, the Nitro audience was just about double that of Raw. In Raw numbers, over the last half hour, the WCW audience increased 535,000 homes and the WWF audience decreased 511,000 homes, and you have to figure with numbers that close that most of those are the same people. Japanese television rundown. January 16th, Pancrase 1. Satoshi Hasegawa beat Koizumi Noah in 1/10 of overtime after they had gone 10 minutes with an ankle lock. Finish was interesting as Minowa was near the ropes and got there and the ref screamed escape at about the same moment he tapped from the pain. Up until that point it had been an even trading of holds with nobody coming close to victory. 2. Katsuomi Inagaki beat Kim Jong-wan in 4:39 when Inagaki got the armbar. Wan controlled most of the match but never came close on a submission. 3. Kyuma Kunyoku beat Kusei Kubota in 7:52. Kunyoku came close twice with a near choke and once with an armbar before getting the armbar. Kobuta came close with an armbar as well. 4. Jason DeLucia beat Takafumi Ito 1-0 after the 10 minutes time limit expired. DeLucia got an over and under choke and Ito escaped to the ropes, which was the only point of the match. DeLucia had control the majority of the match. 5. Asami Shibuya beat Keiichiro Yamamiya in 17:31 with an ankle lock. Not much to say as most Pancrase matches look the same. It's guys on the ground almost like a human chess match going for submission holds, and since the guys are so skilled at blocking and seeing them coming, it's hard to get them. It's different and kind of a fresh change of pace seeing a more often than not legitimate sport that is pro wrestling and started by pro wrestlers. But you have to really be into submissions and the art because it's not as entertaining to the general public because it's mainly strategy and subtleties and only limited striking. 6. Ryushi Yanagisawa beat Jason Godzi in 3:14. Godzi was the most aggressive fighter on the show. Everyone else plays the cautious waiting game for someone to leave something open. Because of that, it was the most interesting and exciting match of the show. Godzi took him down and was physically overpowering him trying for a forearm choke. After they got to the ropes, Godzi shot in again and Yanagisawa tried to time a knee, and connected but Godzi was only slightly stunned and managed to eventually get back in control. When the same thing happened a third time, Yanagisawa knocked the hell out of Godzi with a hard knee to the side of the head and Godzi was out. There were a lot of reports in the US that the match was stopped prematurely but there was no way as Godzi was still spaced out and had no legs well after the match. 7. Semishield beat Minoru Suzuki in 9:52. Suzuki, who is the better wrestler of the two, dominated most of the match against the Holland Giant who is about 1 foot taller than he is. Twice while on top he went for an armbar and came close. On the second attempt when he missed, Schultz was able to reverse him. However, Suzuki got back the advantage and seemed to have a clean armbar on, while Schultz in almost a Rings fashion struggled and got the rope break. If that hold is on clean in a reality situation, there is no time for struggling to dramatically get to the ropes as in pro wrestling as in reality you simply have to tap. Immediately after, when Suzuki went in for another takedown, he caught a knee to the chin and went down and the ref stopped the match. Suzuki was almost laughing as the match was stopped, although the knee was well-timed and clearly rocked Suzuki who may have been laughing because he was so out of it. Suzuki appears susceptible to concussions to begin with due to all the pounding he's taken over the years. The rule of thumb when watching Pancrase is if something looks fishy, there's probably a reason it does, and this did, although it was also a good dramatic finish. January 16th Michinoku Pro. 1. Jinsei Shinzaki beat Yone Jinjin in a Falls Count Anywhere match. Jinjin brought in a styrofoam container filled with snow, but ended up getting a facebuster into the snow. He even had a hard time keeping a straight face from the spot. They wound up climbing into the upper deck and sort of brawled there. Actually it was mainly Jinjin backpedaling away and at one point grabbing a soft drink container from a fan and drinking it. Finish saw Shinzaki put on the Cobra clutch and hang Jinjin off the balcony while holding the hold and Jinjin submitted. At this point Shinzaki and a few others all pulled Jinjin back to safety. Match was terrible although the finish itself was creative. Dud. 2. Superboy and Shoichi Funaki and Dick Togo beat Great Sasuke and Grand Hamada and Tiger Mask in 20:37. Typical excellent Michinoku 6-man main event. The faces did all their dives early including Sasuke doing his Osai moonsault despite having a messed up knee. Sasuke did all his regular spots even with the bad knee. The heels spent most of the match working the knee since this was Sasuke's last match before the surgery. The heels are all good workers and Superboy, who is a Los Angeles-based indie guy, is one of the more underrated wrestlers in the world. There were lengthy spots where Sasuke refused to submit to the figure 4, telling the story he was holding out for the save rather than give up the match, and eventually the save came. Finally Tiger Mask made the hot tag and came in doing all the old Sayama spots, and he does them well. Match finish saw Sasuke use a K-Brata and German suplex for near falls on Funaki, and then went for a space-flying tiger drop but his injured knee gave out. He collapsed on the mat and Funaki gave him a drop kick to the knee and Togo did a senton on the knee before the referee finally stopped the match. 4 1/4 stars. February 5th New Japan. 1. Jushin Liger and El Samurai and Kendo Kashin beat Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto and Tatsuhito Takaiwa in 1647. Only the second half of the match aired on television. It was the same great juniors match as usual, and if anything a little better than usual. Everyone did their regular spots, Takaiwa doing the Death Valley Driver, Otani the springboard dropkick, Samurai the reverse DDT and Kashin doing a great flying armbar submission. Liger got a near fall using a super fisherman buster on Kanemoto. He did a Frankensteiner off the top on Kanemoto, who rolled through for his own near fall. Liger came back with the palm blows before missing a headbutt off the top. Takaiwa gave Liger the triple bomb and Kanemoto went for a moonsault, but Liger got his knees up. Liger hitting a running power bomb on Kanemoto for a near fall and then got the pin after a running palm blow. Super all the way. 4 1/4 stars. 2. Tatsumi Fujinami and Osamu Nishimura beat Osamu Kido and Kazuo Yamazaki in 10:55 when Nishimura pinned Yamazaki with a Northern Lights suplex. The work was good, but all of these guys lack in charisma. The finish was to give Nishimura credibility going into his IWGP title match, but people didn't buy it. 2 stars. 3. Shiro Koshinaka and Tatsutoshi Goto and Michiyoshi Ohara beat Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Keiji Muto and NWO Sting in 1728 when Koshinaka pinned Tenzan after a German suplex. Muto's left knee went out and everyone began working on it. It was weird because the injury looked legit and Koshinaka almost hesitated, and almost instinctively knew what to do. Muto finally made the hot tag to Sting, who was scarily looking so much better than the original, well, not original because the original was the Rock Star, but the more famous wrestling namesake. Muto's work was better than usual and carried this to a pretty good match. 3 1/4 stars. 4. Scott Norton and Big Titan and Masahiro Chono beat Kensuke Sasaki and Shinya Hashimoto and Junji Hirata in 12:59 when Norton pinned Hirata after a power bomb. Titan did a plunge on Hashimoto which got a big pop. Titan didn't look nearly as bad here as he's looked just about everywhere else he's wrestled, which is a real credit to Hashimoto. Hashimoto is getting even fatter, though. Norton also looks better here than anywhere else, which again is probably due to Hashimoto understanding how to work to make him a monster. 2 stars. 1/12 New Japan. 1. Liger pinned Otani in 23:58 to win the IWGP Junior title. Only 9 minutes aired on television. What aired was tremendous and no doubt the match in unedited form would have been even better. They edited more than half out of this match and edited very little out of the IWGP Heavyweight title match since it was the main event, although this match was tons more exciting. Because of it being so edited, it didn't appear to be as good as some of their previous matches, but that could be an unfair statement since looking at magazine photos of this match shows that a lot of the hot spots were left on the editing room floor. Liger was relying on the palm even more than usual for his pops, which probably says something about his physical condition. Otani was doing it all and selling great. Liger finally got the pin after a brainbuster off the top ropes. 4 1/4 stars. 2. Norton and Tenzan and NWO Sting and Titan beat Tadao Yasuda and Hashimoto and Hirata and Yamazaki in a 2 out of 3 fall match. They only aired the finishes of the first 2 falls, with Norton pinned Yasuda with a powerbomb in the first, and Hashimoto pinning Tenzan with a brainbuster in the second. Titan pinned Hirata in the third fall, which was shown in its entirety. Based on what aired, this wasn't good at all. 3. Sasaki beat Nishimura in 25:20 to retain the IWGP Heavyweight title. The idea of this match was to elevate Nishimura, so Sasaki gave him offense nearly the entire match since he was beating him at the end. From that standpoint, even though the work itself was fine, the match didn't work because nobody bought that Nishimura had a chance no matter what he did and how much offense he got. He simply lacks anything special and has no charisma even though he's a solid technical wrestler. The match built to where Nishimura actually did 8 missile dropkicks. He did 3 in a row followed by a Northern Lights suplex for a near fall, but even then the crowd didn't buy it was a finish. He did a 4th missile dropkick followed by an armbar, but Sasaki made the ropes. He then did 3 more for another near fall and people didn't believe it. He then delivered an 8th one and another Northern Lights suplex for the near fall. Sasaki's comeback consisted of a Northern Lights bomb and a lariat and got the pin. This didn't have the feel of a heavyweight title match in Japan at all. 1 star 3/4. Mexico. There are a ton of behind-the-scenes stories that are about to be breaking. Paco Alonso has apparently buried the hatchet with Victor Quiñones and has reopened negotiations to work with the WWF. Alonso was losing talent left and right, which has resulted in his business being terrible because his wrestlers knew they had no outlet to the United States and bigger money. If anything, he was going to lose more talent as time went by, as even his top-paid wrestlers, Negro Casas, who also works as booker, and Dr. Wagner Jr., have had discussions of jumping ship of late. I don't know how far discussions have gone, but WWF is interested in signing 3 more Mexican wrestlers up for its light heavyweight division. Alonso did get his in by saying to WWF officials that Eric Bischoff had lied to him in negotiations and not come through with what he promised, as Alonso had gone in the Mexican media a long time ago stating that he would be getting 15 WCW contracts for his wrestlers. There has also been discussion of Alonso working to get WWF television on Univision, which is the largest network in Mexico, leading to WWF running occasional house shows in Mexico City. While the names of the WWF wrestlers right now mean nothing in Mexico aside from the border towns where the fans would know the guys from American television, although Steve Austin made all the papers there for the Tyson angle. But if WWF got network television in Mexico, they would be able to draw huge. With the economy in Mexico City the way it is, there is a question as to how much money they could truly make even with a sellout crowd at Arena Mexico, and if it would be worth their while to do so the way U.S. business is right now. While all kinds of rumors were flying that a deal has already been completed, at press time it was still in the talking stages. In addition, there are all kinds of rumors stemming from Antonio Pena booking his biggest show of the year on March 1st at El Toreo in Naucalpan, as Pena has promised the surprise debut of 4 major superstars. When Conan missed the February 20 promo Azteca television taping in Tulancingo, rumors started flying like crazy, putting 1 and 1 together, but none of that is the case, other than he did miss the show due to an auto accident. The only thing announced for the show is it would be a tournament to crown the 2nd annual El Rey de Reyes, which means the King of Kings in AAA. EMLL had its first major show of the year at Arena Mexico on February 20, headlined by Emilio Charles Jr. versus Wagner Jr. on top in the breakup of longtime tag team partners. Charles got the face reaction. Everyone in the company came out wearing new ring outfits that were said to be flashier and glitzier. It's apparently part of the realization that the old style and traditions of Arena Mexico wasn't cutting it anymore and they have to modernize the product. Lizmark is now scheduled to debut on March 6th for Azteca, but Pepe Arguello was talked back into staying with EMLL. Hector Garza's knee is still bad, so he still hasn't returned to action. After Venom no-showed a match in Monterrey, his mask versus mask match against Super Crazy that was scheduled for late March was moved to March 6th, after which point he'll be taking time off. AAA's business has picked up of late, using 2 brothers who are mainstream television stars as wrestlers as a novelty act. Its big show of the week was February 21st in Tlaxcala with a 6 minis match in a cage and octagon, and La Parca Jr. and Blue Demon Jr. versus Pentagon and AAA Psicosis and Black Demon. You know, the Blue Demon versus Black Demon feud, as Pena continues to recycle his good ideas from a few years back to the point they are now beyond stale ideas. All Japan. There is still nothing new when it comes to negotiations for the Tokyo Dome show. Johnny Ace did get back to ECW wanting a Kenta Kobashi versus Bam Bam Bigelow match, with Kobashi going over, and ECW wanted Shane Douglas going over in a title match against Hiroshi Hase in exchange, but that hasn't been agreed to. From a WWF standpoint, nothing new has transpired. Whether the 2 sides will work together later this year as far as WWF sending talent to All Japan tours is one thing, but time is getting late for putting together a deal for May 1st. According to WWF officials, Vince McMahon wanted to be at the negotiating sessions in Japan, but that it was Giant Baba who suggested that McMahon miss the first meeting because it would become a media nightmare. There was also trepidation at suggestions of a top WWF star doing a job for a top AJ wrestler, and then having the AJ wrestler come to the US and return the favor. The feeling is that, say Shawn Michaels for example losing to Kobashi, would mean something in Japan, but if Kobashi then came to the US and put over Michaels, it would mean nothing in the US. We have no word on the Dome advance, but we do know that all 6,000 tickets priced at 30,000 yen, $250, sold out the first day they were put on sale, so the show is already a winner with nothing even officially announced. The Champion Carnival Round Robin Tournament takes place from March 21st at Korakuen Hall, with the finals on April 18th at Budokan Hall, with major shows on March 29th in Nagoya, March 31st in Osaka, and April 7th in Kumamoto. The foreigners will be Stan Hansen, Steve Williams, Johnny Ace, Gary Albright, Wolf Hockfield, Johnny Smith, and Giant Kimala 2. The biggest show of the week was February 20th in Hiroshima before a sellout 4,200 with Mitsuharu Misawa and Jun Akiyama beating Kenta Kobashi and Ace in 30-25 when Akiyama pinned Kobashi for the first time in his career after 3 exploder suplexes. Semifinal saw Albright pin Toshiaki Kawada in 8:55 with a dragon suplex. Given that Kawada is getting the title shot at the Dome, this result seems to indicate Kawada may finally beat Misawa, and he's now in the process of creating legitimate big show contenders for the future. Kawada also did a job earlier this tour in a tag team match for Hansen, and Hansen was kept strong going to a 30-minute draw and a singles match on February 24th in Shizuoka against Kobashi. February 8th TV show did a 2.5 rating. New Japan. Even with the March tour starting in less than 2 weeks, there has been nothing announced. The holdup appears to be the problem in putting together the 8-man tournament with the winner facing Antonio Inoki on the April 4th Tokyo Dome show. A press conference was held this week where the tournament was expected to be announced, but the only thing announced is that the Dome show would air in primetime on TV Asahi from 7 to 9 p.m. on April 6th and that Ichiro Furutachi, who was at the press conference, would do the announcing on that show. Furutachi was New Japan's announcer during its big hot period in the early 80s when its business in many ways was comparable to WCW today with NWO Angle with the big stars, Cultish Gun, and the junior heavyweights drawing sellouts almost every night. Wrestling drew huge ratings in those ratings, often better than a 20.0 rating in prime time, which shows the mainstream impact wrestling had in that period. Furutachi capitalized on his fame as the wrestling announcer to become a major television personality. The only names officially announced for the tournament are still Naoya Ogawa and Don Frye, and none of the New Japan headliners want any part of it. Names rumored as being contacted included Sid Vicious, who would fit in like a cat in a swimming pool, and Genichiro Tenryu, who publicly turned it down. Other names bandied about include Inoki's longtime regular foe Yoshiaki Fujiwara, Kazuo Yamazaki and rookie Kazuyuki Fujita, the latter of whom is a prelim wrestler in New Japan but did a great job already in 2 matches against Frye. There seem to be problems cropping up between New Japan and WCW. Reports we've heard are that New Japan canceled bookings with WCW wrestlers starting in March, although the relations between the two groups aren't scheduled to end, but may be hanging by a thread. February 7th TV show did a 2.6 rating. Other Japan notes. Pancrase announced March 1st in Kobe will be Minoru Suzuki vs. Keiichiro Yamamiya, Yuki Kondo vs. Asami Shibuya, Jason DeLucia vs. Satoshi Hasegawa, Takaku Fuke vs. Katsumi Inagaki, Takafumi Ito vs. Kim Jong-wan and Kusei Kubota vs. Hagar Chen. The following show will be March 18th at Korakuen Hall headlined by Guy Mesger vs. Ryushi Yanagisawa with the winner of that match getting the title shot at Masakatsu Funaki on the April 26th Japanese pay-per-view show from Yokohama. Weekly Fight has been reporting that Pancrase is planning on its 5-year anniversary spectacular for September and is talking about actually running it at the Tokyo Dome with Funaki headlining against a superstar from the martial arts world. Pancrase doesn't even run Sumo Hall, 11,000 seats, anymore, with its top shows now in Yokohama Bunka Gym 5,000, so doing a dome show sounds hard to believe. Rings has a minor show on March 3rd at Korakuen Hall headlined by Kiyoshi Tamura vs. Sergei Susarov of Russia. The April 9th K1 show at Yokohama Arena, which features Maurice Smith, is being called K1 Kings 98. Rumors are cropping up again that the March 20th Kingdom show in Yokohama will be the final card for the promotion. Apparently the wrestlers will continue with a new backer and another name change. Asia Kongsersion promotion debuted at Korakuen Hall on February 18th before a sellout of 2,200 fans. They had 4 singles matches, and then brought 6 of the wrestlers who had worked underneath back for a 6-man tag where Kong and Michiko Omukai and Yumi Fukawa beat Mikiko Futagami and Rita Mata and Candy Akutsu. They tried to do a more shoot-oriented style as all the undercard finishes were by submission, although the main event had a pinfall ending. There is a lot of controversy in some cities regarding this group. Much of the house show promotion outside of Tokyo is putting up the only style handbill posters all over town. If you go into a smaller town where any of the groups have a show, you'll see the posters everywhere. This promotion, since it's new and trying to get attention, has the women in semi-nude poses on the poster, basically wearing bikini bottoms and going topless but with their hands covering their breasts. Several of the cities have now banned those posters. The Korakuen Hall show was the first women's show ever on pay-per-view in Japan, however, it was with a smaller distributor so the universe for this show was practically nil. At this point, the pay-per-view shows are more done by the satellite companies to get people to hook up to satellite rather than as a way that anyone can actually make money off the shows. FMW is doing its own March tournament to set up the independent World Heavyweight and World Brass Knucks title challenger for Mr. Ganasuke on April 30th at Yokohama Bunka Gym. Tournament first round matches will be from March 7th to March 13th, with semifinals on March 16th in I-Weight and the tournament final on March 17th at Korakuen Hall. First round matches are Hayabusa vs. Masato Tanaka, which takes place on the biggest show of the tour on March 13th in Sapporo, Jado vs. Tetsuhiro Kuroda, The Gladiator vs. Hisakatsu Oya and Koji Nakagawa vs. Yukihiro Kanemura. Besides the Hayabusa Tanaka main event in Sapporo, they have a match, and check out this name for a match, a four corners handcuffs fucking dog briefs match with Atsushi Onita and Nakagawa and Kuroda and Hideki Hasaka vs. Kanemura and Ganasuke and Haido and a mystery partner. Not exactly sure what this is all about, but apparently the match will be wrestled with everyone wearing underwear briefs. They've been doing angles where the guys come out in their underwear for the last few weeks. Michinoku Pro Wrestling, without Great Sasuke and being run by Super Delphin, restarts on February 28th and has major shows on March 1st in Osaka and March 10th at Tokyo Ota Ward Gymnasium. February 28th will feature help from FMW as the main event will be Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki vs. Kanemura and Ganasuke. March 1st in Osaka is headlined by Hayabusa and Delphin vs. Grand Naniwa and Tiger Mask. Dick Togo is currently in Mexico so isn't expected to be part of Kaientai DX on this tour, while Naniwa and Naohiro Hoshikawa are expected to work in March for Big Japan. Hiromichi Fuyuki's promotion ran Korakuen Hall on February 19th, packing the place with Fuyuki over Hayabusa in a lumberjack match. They are doing a heel ref gimmick in this group. Koki Kitahara, formerly of War, debuted on this show. War announced March 10th at Korakuen Hall with Tenryu and a mystery partner against Nobutaka Araya and Jun Kikuchi on top. In what is being billed as Mayumi Ozaki's final match with JWP on March 6th, she faces Rieko Amano. Ozaki showed up at Gia's February 22nd show at Korakuen Hall and said that she wanted to form a tag team with Akira Hokuto. Tarzan Goto will be starting up another new promotion with women wrestler Kyoko Ichiki and Chihiro Nakano, male wrestlers Mitsunobu Kikuzawa and Katsutoshi Niyama. Here and there. This week's version of those stories that seem to only happen in wrestling. Gary Dean Mabe, 36, who wrestles independently in the Carolinas for New Dimension Wrestling under the name Handsome Bill Armstrong, was taken into custody on February 23 in Jacksonville, Florida after he had fled the Carolinas after being charged with raping his underage daughter over a 2-year period. Mabe was charged with 2 counts of statutory rape, 2 counts of statutory sex, and 2 counts of taking indecent liberties with a minor. Mabe fled the Carolinas when charges were filed against him on February 13, leaving in a 1977 van owned by the promotion. The police were tipped off on February 23 that he was in Jacksonville and was found staying in a tent. The Sid Vicious saga continued this week. Vicious, after canceling a February 15 autograph session in New Jersey the night before, no-showed another autograph session this weekend, and also no-showed Ian Rotten's Eddie Gilbert Memorial Show on February 21 in Louisville. The latter show, which drew 500, was said to have been a fiasco since Austin Idol and Tom Pritchard also no-showed. Rotten got in the ring before the show started and held a money order in his hand for $500, saying it was half of Idol's money which he paid in advance, and that Idol never got on the plane, and said that he would prosecute. He said that Pritchard injured his back training Mark Henry and wasn't allowed to travel. That's becoming a common theme, both the back injury and injuries trying to work with Henry, but that he informed him in advance and had already refunded his plane ticket money. Danny Davis was there, but was said to be unable to wrestle due to health reasons. Then, later in the show, it was announced that Sid wasn't there, and Rotten claims Sid has assured him the night before that he was going to be there. The main event wound up being Dutch Mantle and Doug Gilbert beating Terry Gordy and Dan Severn. It was said that there was a style clash big time with Severn, and that Gordy looked totally lost and out of shape. At one point Gilbert threw a fireball at Gordy, who forgot to sell it. Tommy Gilbert worked the undercard beating Buddy Landell. WCW ref Mark Curtis, Brian Hildebrand, who has been battling cancer, made his first in-ring appearance in several months at the show as a ref. He was said to have looked very thin, as word we get is he's dropped from 145 pounds to 105 pounds battling cancer. Sid is scheduled on the other Eddie Gilbert show in Philadelphia on February 28 in the main event against King Kong Bundy. Sid did show up on February 19th in Lula, Mississippi, working for Jerry Lawler's casino shows, working the main event before 375 fans and doing an angle to set up a singles match against Mabel on February 26th. Lawler has been using the likes of Reggie B. Fine, Bill Dundee, Ryan Christopher and Tracy Smothers on his weekly shows. One of the other featured attractions for the NWA February 28th Philadelphia show, an arm wrestling match with Sunny vs. Marlena, is off the books. Sunny was scheduled as the main attraction on a sold show on February 21st for an NWA show and canceled the day before, and instead worked the ECW show doing the angle with Chris Condito. Apparently has turned into a major fiasco as the sponsors were furious she wasn't there, and when they announced it was due to transportation problems, the word had already spread in the building that she was actually at the ECW show, which was 25 minutes away and only made the situation worse. Dennis Coralizzo got the booking through the WWF. What is really strange is that since Sunny did an angle which started a story that will continue at the pay-per-view, to do an angle with a WWF contracted personality, they no doubt had to inform the WWF of everything in advance and get it cleared. At least you'd think that. Coralizzo was furious because Sunny never actually called him to cancel, and instead only told Jim Cornette she couldn't make the date the previous day without giving a reason as to why. No doubt there was heat since Coralizzo was promoting the Gilbert show in Philadelphia for the following weekend, and her fiancé is an assistant booker with ECW, and NWA never get along for too many reasons to list in a 16-page newsletter. Some notes on the February 14th show in London, England, which included Sabu and Rob Van Dam. Sabu beat Ulf Herman and Van Dam beat Michael Kovac underneath as part of a tournament which also saw Mikey Whipwreck and promoter Dirt Bike Kid, Jason Harrison, go over. Sabu and Van Dam refused to wrestle in their semifinal, so Kid beat Whipwreck. This is where Whipwreck blew out his knee again to win the tournament. But to make up for it, Sabu and Van Dam came back in a tag match to beat Herman and Kovac again. The show drew 500 fans and was said to overall be a good show. NWA will be running a show on March 27th in Mount Holly, New Jersey, with a triangle match to crown an NWA National Heavyweight Champion with Barry Windham, Doug Gilbert, and Buddy Landell. This, at this point, isn't scheduled as part of the WWF NWA angle. He create a title for WWF television, or for Windham to win, at least at this point. Rey Mysterio, Super Parka, Super Muñeco and Tijuana heels like Medico Asesino Jr. and Genghis Khan headline shows on February 14th in Salem, Oregon before 550 and February 15th in Hillsboro, Oregon before 150. However, the biggest news in Oregon is yet another resurfacing of Billy Jack Haynes. The last sightings of Haynes were back in October when he came back to work with Matt Osborne. The two were challenging each other to shoot fights months earlier in the media, but supposedly ran out on a loan from Osborne and disappeared again. Haynes was back on the radio talking about returning to the ring and running down the quality of the local wrestlers, in particular local football hero Josh Wilcox, saying none of them had ever gone anywhere. Anyway, there was yet another incident over the weekend where Haynes allegedly attacked some people working at the radio station and the police were called. Music City Wrestling will be running the traditional weekly Tuesday night shows at the Louisville Gardens starting on March 17th. The Louisville shows had been run by Mike Sample's Kentuckiana Championship Wrestling. Sunshine Wrestling Federation, based in Miami, has changed its name to Florida Championship Wrestling. Leigh Thatcher is working on a Brian Pillman benefit show on April 29th at the Norwood, Ohio Middle School, which Pillman attended. He's working on getting a WWF, WCW and ECW presence all on the same show, which would be quite a trick. Steve Austin will be appearing at the show as a special guest, but not to wrestle. San Antonio is starting up a weekly Lucha Libre-style promotion coming on the heels of Houston doing strong business every week in a 1,500-seat arena. Like Houston, they'll be using non-WCW wrestlers from Promo Azteca as the headliners. Alex Merves will be starting a weekly pro wrestling column every Friday in the Rocky Mountain News Spotlight section. NHB, a correction from last week. At this point, the probable main event for the UFC pay-per-view show following the March 13th show, which will take place on May 15th at a site not yet determined, is Randy Couture versus Mark Coleman for the heavyweight title. This is far from signed and easily could change, but it appears to be at this point the most likely main event. The March 13th show will be airing like on Sport TV in Brazil. It isn't a definite that Nippon TV in Japan will be airing the show, although it has been seriously discussed, and will also air in France and the Netherlands on pay-per-view. UFC has been doing about a 1.0 buy rate in France. The latest copy of Billboard magazine lists the UFC 9 pay-per-view has the number 2 listed video of any type in the sell-through home market. The plans, again tentative, are to do 2 more shows this year in Japan, one in June and another in September. According to David Isaacs, the actual figures for the first Japan show on December 21st at the Yokohama Arena were about 10,000 people in the building and 5,500 paid. The lineup, as is penciled in right now for March 13th in New Orleans, is Frank Shamrock vs. Igor Zinoviev for the middleweight title as the main event, Kimo vs. Tsuyoshi Kosaka, which was officially announced in a UFC press release this week, Jerry Bollander vs. Kevin Jackson, an under 170-pound tournament with first-round matches of Mike Burnett, Lions Den vs. Eugenio Tadeu, a relatively well-known Brazilian luta-livre fighter who was the main eventer against Renzo Gracie on the recent show in Rio de Janeiro where a riot stopped the match and wound up with the sport banned in that city, and Pat Militic, who has a legitimate NHB record of 18-1-1, versus Townsend Saunders, a freestyle wrestler who captured a silver medal in the 1996 Olympics. There will also be 2 additional alternate-level matches. On paper, this may be the most interesting and evenly competitive series of matches in UFC history. Certainly the depth of fighter quality in the show would be at or near the top, comparing favorably with even the Ultimates, maybe not for marquee value, but definitely for overall skill level. None of the matches on paper look to be locks, and this is about the first UFC one can ever recall thinking that ahead of time. However, it is a marketing gamble going with a middleweight match as the main event for the first time in company history, even though Shamrock did come out of the previous show as a bona fide superstar and Zinoviev is champion of the defunct EFC, making it something of a unification match. Kevin Jackson will be coming off a gold medal winner's performance at 187 pounds in the Tiki Cup, a world-class freestyle wrestling tournament that ended on February 20th in Iran. It was the first time the U.S. team had competed in Iran in many years, and the meet drew a ton of national mainstream media attention. Melvin Douglas, a former World Cup champion, took a silver medal at 213 pounds. Douglas was scheduled to make his NHB debut on March 1st for Shudo in Japan, but with the injury to opponent Enson Inoue, we're not sure if a replacement has been found or if his debut will be postponed. There will also be a major submissions-only wrestling tournament held March 20th to March 22nd in Abu Dhabi. Among the names from NHB listed as being in the various weight class tournament are Dennis Hall, an Olympic silver medalist, competing at 143 pounds, John Lewis, Renzo Gracie, Matt Hume and Todd Bjornithan at 167 pounds, Oleg Tokarov and Mario Sperry at 215 pounds and Dan Severn and Antoine Alvarez in the heavyweight division. The final court battle over the infamous series of arrests of fighters and promoters in Quebec after the April 26, 1996 Extreme Fighting pay-per-view show ended a few weeks back. Promoter Mike Thomas at a hearing in Montreal pleaded bargain to accepting a $1,000 fine and his record will be erased provided he doesn't promote any more illegal sporting events. Thomas never accepted the EFC event as being illegal since it was sanctioned by the Mohawk Athletic Commission, held on sovereign Indian land near Montreal. Thomas is planning on promoting another NHB show in the same building in Conaway, Quebec on May 2nd, and it will be very interesting to see how Canadian authorities react to that. Becky Levi is going into pro boxing with her first match on March 21st in Atlantic City. ECW. ECW lost its television in Pittsburgh, which has been its best-drawing market, on WPTT over the dreaded content problem. The main item is that the station got a new general manager who specifically pointed out the language in the crowd and in particular the "fuck New York" chants from the last ECW Arena show as the reason, but also had a problem with the blood and the violence level. Paul Heyman said they were willing to dub special tapes for Pittsburgh in which any offensive chants would be edited off the show, but that the GM kept bringing up other problems with the content, that he knew it was a losing battle. Heyman said the company was very close to a done deal with a rival station in Pittsburgh to air the show in the same Saturday night at 11 p.m. slot, which could start as early as this week or next. 2 more sellouts over the weekend with shows on February 20th in Woodbridge, New Jersey, 1,200, and February 21st at the ECW Arena, 1,500. The arena show was described as better than average, with a solid undercard but a poor main event with Sabu and Rob Van Dam versus Bam Bam Bigelow and Shane Douglas. Apparently there was a fight in the crowd which took several minutes to break up and killed the first 5 minutes of the match. At that point, the match was really sloppy with problems like tables breaking before the spot, etc. It ended when Bigelow pinned Van Dam with the Asbury Park Michinoku driver. Sabu and Van Dam argued after the match, teasing a turn, but ended up hugging at the end. From the opener, it started with Jerry Lynn pinning Danny During. Roadkill, who is part of the prelim group that accompanies During, is now doing an Amish gimmick. Al Snow pinned Tracy Smothers. Snow used the head on all three members of the FBI, causing Tommy Rich to juice heavily, then using the Snowplow Northern Lights bomb on all three members before doing a low blow with the head on Smothers for the finish. Chris Chetty pinned Doug Furnace. They teased a split up between Furnace and Lance Wright, but that didn't materialize. They did another argument with Sonny and Chris Condito, who were arguing about Lance Storm and wound up in a pull-apart, winding up with Storm pinning Condito in their singles match. Taz beat Brackus in 90 seconds of a match that was said to be fine because it was kept short. Justin Credible beat Tommy Dreamer in a first blood match. Dreamer brought out barbed wire. There was a ref bump. Van Dam interfered and cut up Dreamer, so both guys were bloody, but the ref saw Dreamer bleeding first. This was said to have been a pretty good match. Credible gave Beulah a tombstone after the match. Given that this is pro wrestling, this will probably lead to Beulah leaving Dreamer for Credible. Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney and Sandman won a three-way dance over Bubba Ray and D-Von and Big Dick Dudley and New Jack and Spike Dudley and John Cronus in a wild match as well. Woodbridge, which sold out well in advance, was said to have been a horrible show. Darren Drostoff, another WWF trainee, had a short match with Taz that was basically a squash, with Drostoff not showing much. Apparently the knee injury Mikey Whipwreck suffered in England on his first match back after surgery set him way back. ECW is trying to finalize the deal to send Douglas, Francine, Taz, Dreamer, Beulah and maybe Van Dam to FMW in late April. This past week's television was built around the Dreamer Credible angle, with them using Dreamer's grandfather's death in what comes off as a pathetic attempt to get heel heat on Credible. Not that it won't work. Given the timing of everything, it played a lot worse the second week than it did the first week, and it was bad then. The storyline is that even the heels and even Credible's own manager thought he went over the line. The Spicoli death was never mentioned on this week's show, although the arena show opened with them dedicating the show to his memory, airs this coming week. WCW Nitro on February 23 in Sacramento, California drew a nearly packed house of 12,307, 9,957, paying $172,976 for what was among the best episodes ever of Nitro. The show opened Diamond Dallas Page, Booker T, Ric Flair and Bret Hart talking about how disappointed they were with Scott Steiner joining the NWO and turning on his brother. Unlike the majority of angles which just are left to hang on their own, this was really pushed throughout the show as an angle the equivalent of a Hogan angle. Lex Luger got in the ring. The crowd heavily booed Luger, and when he brought up Sting beating Hogan the previous night, there were still more boos than cheers. He challenged Scott Steiner, but instead Curt Hennig and Rick Rude came out. That match only went 1:30 before Scott Steiner, with blonde hair and a multicolored beard, looking like a cross between a taller Paul Ellering and a shorter John Knorr, although most were comparing him with Superstar Graham, interfered for the DQ. Luger then had a match with Scott which went 39 seconds before Scott busted his eye badly, cameras pulled away, until Marcus Bagwell interfered for the DQ. The entire NWOB team came out, Rude, Hennig, Bryan Adams, Vincent, Scott Norton, Conan, to destroy Luger until finally Sting came from the ceiling and everyone left. A whole bunch of WCW guys came in together, both faces and heels, to attend to Luger. It was really funny seeing Barbarian wearing a tie in the ring acting concerned, kind of killing his gimmick. They announced that the governor of Minnesota had declared February 27th as Ric Flair Day, and wouldn't you know it, that's also the day WCW tickets go on sale for the next Minneapolis show. And wouldn't you know it, Flair is scheduled to do an autograph signing in town to kick off ticket sales. Now what are the odds of those three things happening all at the same time, independent of one another? Diamond Dallas Page beat Hammer with the Diamond Cutter in 3:45 to keep the U.S. title. They must have really practiced this out because it was a good TV bout. The Flock attacked Page after the match and Chris Benoit made the save. Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff came out, with them ripping on Nick Patrick, Hogan clearly portraying the belt and Sting as secondary to his feud with Savage, and challenged Savage to a cage match at Uncensored, and Savage, in the crowd, accepted. Ultimo Dragon beat Kaz Hayashi in 4:17 with a Dragon Sleeper. Hayashi was Shiryu, the former Michinoku wrestler who now works for Promo Azteca, without his mask. The announcers totally ignored the match, but it was a very good match with Hayashi looking impressive. Apparently the reason they used him without a mask is this was his tryout, and since it would be on television, if they were impressed, and they should have been, then they can debut him later as Shiryu, not that they'll push him either way. Of course the crowd could have cared less. Benoit beat Raven via DQ in 4:20 of another very good TV match. Raven took some great bumps and Benoit had him pinned after a rolling German suplex when the flock all ran in. Aren't Raven's rules no disqualification? And when they were using all the chairs, it was specifically pointed out to be Raven's rules. Remember, when you watch WCW, you have to leave your brain somewhere else. The flock all beat up Benoit until Page made the save. It wound up with Page and Benoit hitting each other and brawling in a three-way for a while until Page and Benoit worked together to clean house, but again at each other afterwards. Chris Jericho beat Lenny Lane in 342 with the Lion Tamer. It was a little sloppy, but Jericho gave Lane a lot of offense and the crowd got into it sensing an upset. Jericho wore Guerrera's mask to the ring. Guerrera should have made an appearance doing a run-in. Rick Steiner pinned Vincent in 135 with a bulldog off the top rope. Perry Saturn beat Yuji Nagata with the Rings of Saturn at 635 in a bad match. They didn't click at all. Saturn always works hard but often seems not to click. Booker T beat Renegade in 415 to keep the TV title with a side kick. Awful except for T throwing what must be the best missile dropkick in the world. Conan beat Lizmark Jr. in 344 with the Tequila Sunrise. Probably the best Lizmark has looked in WCW. Norton and Bagwell beat High Voltage in 511 when Buff did the blockbuster on Rage. This was a total New Japan style match and was really good and the crowd totally got into it. Rage has a ton of potential and showed it here. Chaos didn't show a thing but he wasn't in the ring enough to hurt the match. Within this style, Norton even looked good. Eddie Guerrero beat Disco Inferno with a frog splash in 512. Disco was all bruised up from his match the previous night with La Parka. J.J. Dillon did an interview bringing out Nick Patrick and congratulating him on his work the previous night. Patrick was very subtly giving signs at the end he was still going heel. Ric Flair beat Brad Armstrong with a low blow and a figure 4 in 355. It's funny, Flair got this giant reaction coming out. They did all the stuff that would have popped a crowd 10 years ago. Armstrong still can do what he used to do, and Flair tries although he's slowed down. My feeling is except for a special occasion, Flair should never wrestle on television and just do interviews because he can be the old Ric Flair doing an interview because he's the best at that, but it kills the illusion he's the old Ric Flair in a TV match of this type.